for our guests' sake, this is a famous landmark in Seattle, the Hammering Man, and I'm the reflex hammering man. And what can a neurologist really bring to this conversation? And I would say that what we experience, I call the crucible of the clinic, right? So we're dealing every day with people who are receiving a diagnosis of dementia, who didn't choose to attend a talk like this, who haven't necessarily thought that this is something that might happen to them, who are reaching for whatever tools or ideas they have about dementia. And what they are in general up against is what we call the narrative of loss, a very narrowly framed concept of dementia, global, loss, now, suddenly, everything is different. And there are among people that may think the same way, and we've heard people talk about, and I've seen this many times with patients, they may even receive a diagnosis of mild cognitive impairment, but immediately people are talking to their spouse instead of them. So there's this narrative of loss, and it's even something that we hear bought into for what otherwise might be really good reasons. So in what we call messaging for urgent action, trying to mobilize public funding, let's say, to work on Alzheimer's disease, the message is what? There's a big tsunami of dementia coming. This is going to be amazingly bad, right? And when there is some hopeful news, for example, we've learned that in some of the developed societies, the rate of incidence of dementia is actually falling a little bit. Okay, and this is because of systematic control of hypertension. It's because of better education, and I'll get back to that in a little while. That's good news. That actually there is some malleability of the relationship between the disease and the expression of the disease. But it's overwhelmed by the numbers of people that are arriving in older age because of control of other diseases. But that's not something people want to talk about if they're trying to raise money or motivate public funding for research. So what I thought I would do is to talk about how we have learned to bring a more positive but scientifically grounded and forward-looking view of brain health to our patients and their families. And this has motivated us sort of from the ground up to reach out to the broader community, as I'll get to. So the two big ideas are strength-based reframing, which we can think about as understanding Alzheimer's disease across all its stages and the abilities that a person retains in the midst of them. And I'll talk mostly about that today, but also this idea of dementia-friendly community. This resonates a lot with the ideas we just heard from Dr. O'Connor, where people with memory loss and dementia are understood, included, and empowered so as to live well into their potential. So we'll talk about these things. We're going to start very easy, which I've learned is a really important thing to do, even with a very professional audience, to distinguish dementia and Alzheimer's disease, because I dare say there are people that wonder about that. And we'll go from there. So bear with me, this is the only complicated slide I have. I think about it this way. There's a set of diseases, if you will, Alzheimer's being one, but others that lead to degenerative changes, structural changes in the brain. The brain tissue shrinks. That's called atrophy. In that condition, the brain circuits begin not to work so well, and that's what leads to trouble with memory and thinking, right? And in the clinic, then, we are actually about two levels of diagnosis. First of all, what's wrong with the mind, what's the syndrome, that might be dementia, it might be something short of dementia like mild cognitive impairment. And then what's wrong with the brain? What could you see if you could look under the microscope? What would be the matter? Okay, that might be Alzheimer's disease. That might be frontotemporal degeneration. But there's two levels of diagnosis there, right? What is someone experiencing, and then what's actually going on in the brain. And if you can keep that straight, the difference between dementia and, say, Alzheimer's disease, it saves a lot of confusion, even among medical audiences. Okay, I could go on for a few minutes about how it's sort of built into our professional ways of describing this, that there's a confusion. Okay, and then it turns out that this relationship between the brain changes and the mind changes is not hard and fast. Okay, it is possible to build a stronger brain that is resistant or resilient, as we say, to these changes. And this has a lot to do with what you do through midlife in terms of your lifestyle. How cognitively active are you? How physically active are you? Maybe most importantly, how socially connected are you? And you can change your tipping point by more than a decade, depending on what you do. Okay. So that's one of the things I'll come back to. So we have to go into the biology of this a little bit. So what is actually Alzheimer's disease then? So Alzheimer's disease, as I said, this is the microscopic characteristic changes that Dr. Alzheimer saw in his famous case. These things called amyloid plaques. They're outside the nerve cells. This amyloid protein seems to be what insults the brain in the first place. And these things called neurofibrillary tangles that are inside the nerve cells that are marking the cells that aren't working well, sort of tracing the impact of the disease, if you will. And if you see plaques and tangles, it's Alzheimer's disease. It's very interesting. Our scientific field is now radically defining Alzheimer's disease based on detecting these proteins, regardless of what your cognitive state is. And it's amazing, there's a lot of pushback from the field about this sort of redefinition of Alzheimer's disease. But it does radically separate what's wrong physically from what's wrong mentally. Does that make sense? And we've learned that these tangles that I just mentioned that mark the cells that are degenerating, they don't appear everywhere in the brain. They appear in some places really early, and they gradually spread to involve more of the brain. You can see in the first column, it starts sort of right here in the, what we call the medial temporal lobe, right there. And that's the area of the brain where that really needs to be intact in order to encode and remember new material. Okay, and then gradually spreads to involve more of the brain. There's 6 progressively severe stages of this. First, as I said, in that medial temporal lobe, and that's ground zero for memory, and that's why memory tends to be the leading problem, maybe the only problem for quite a while. And then it spreads to these areas that are called association regions of the brain. That's correlated with cognitive loss, have trouble thinking about information, if you will. And then the motor and the sensory regions are affected last or maybe never, and that's why people with Alzheimer's disease don't have any elementary physical problems. They walk normally, they hear and see, and enjoy the moment normally, and you might not tumble to how serious the problem is when you first meet somebody, right? Okay, so that's kind of what happens biologically. And let me just ask a question here. So I just talked about 6 progressively severe stages. How bad do you think it has to be before you have dementia? What stage? How many people think stage 2, 3, 2 hands, 4, 5? Well, the answer answer is it's got to be up there around 4 and 5 before before I, as a specialist, could say, I think we could call this dementia now. Okay. It's that far along, pathologically. What about the earliest measurable memory loss? Not any impairment in daily living, but some measurable memory loss. You're down a standard deviation and a half on some test. Stage 2, 3. Okay, so the answer is pretty much early 3.
Is that MCI?
And that's MCI. We use that term mild cognitive impairment, deceptively generic term for the leading memory edge of an Alzheimer dementia. And then stages 1 and 2, truly asymptomatic, no symptoms, can't detect it. And we have learned that is how it breaks down over time, that the dementia phase, you've probably heard if you've experienced this yourself or have a loved one who's been in one of these clinics, 8 or 10 years from the time of diagnosis is your sort of average life expectancy. But before that, there's at least 5 years of this mild cognitive impairment, and before that, these asymptomatic stages probably go on for 15 years. Okay? So dementia is really, truly just the last stage of something that's been going on, arguably, for decades already. And many people actually never get to dementia. And when they do, they don't necessarily have this catastrophic form that everybody thinks about, and it's so stigmatizing. So if you're thinking about it this way, and framed on dementia, you're sort of missing the big picture of all the 2 or 3 other people that have pre-symptomatic disease for every one person who has dementia. And we've learned that about 25 or 30% of us by age 65 have these preclinical changes. It's truly a democratic disease. So it's something that we're all on this road in some sense. Okay, and then we've learned that there isn't this just up and down relationship of stage to people's symptoms. You can kind of lean in. You can be someone who, even though you have stage 5 disease, might still only have mild cognitive impairment. Okay, and how does that happen? And that happens because of these effects of education and cognitive lifestyle and physical activity and good diet and so forth that can help you lean in. And that makes a big difference. It makes years of difference as to when you might become symptomatic. And even after you're symptomatic, these kinds of interventions can still help you prolong your functional independence. Okay, so that's one piece of it. The other thing that I really want to spend a little time with is that we have learned that not all the brain regions and the systems that depend on those regions are equally affected. I sort of said that already when I said these changes occur gradually and beginning in a certain place. I can't point to both at the same time. I'll favor the left side of the room here. It's a heat map, so the red areas are affected the most, the blue areas the least, and this is obviously a brain, and all I want you to see is that there's a big spectrum, and the temporal lobe here is badly affected early, but other areas are not so affected, and those areas that are blue are the areas that receive vision and hearing, the sort of sensory regions of the brain, and or send the motor output from the brain. So the elementary sensory motor areas. And those spared systems are the basis for retained strengths. They are arguably normal in patients with mild to moderate Alzheimer's dementia and can be taken advantage of. Okay? So one example of that, and Dr. Swinton touched on this. Remember, he said the body remembers, right? There's more than one kind of memory. There's the kind of memory for new material called episodic memory. That's generally having trouble in Alzheimer's disease and dementia, but there's this kind of memory called procedural memory or muscle memory. You've heard the term muscle memory. I think I have a slide with muscle memory coming up here. The way you learn new habits or skills by dint of repetition, right? By doing things over and over again. But the nice thing about this system is it's slow, but it doesn't forget. It doesn't forget. And in someone with Alzheimer's disease, it also doesn't forget. So we've taken advantage of this. One of the programs we've offered for our patients, actually a program that, as we began to do that, was kind of sponsored by Skyline, here, our host today. The Habit program, and now its successor, the Adapt program, that use this kind of spared procedural memory to compensate for impaired episodic memory. So we have a memory boot camp, a month of repeated classes with a care partner that involves these principles and others to help people prolong their functional independence. Oops. Some other examples of retained strengths that I might touch on. So experiencing the world in the moment. We heard a little bit about this from our other speakers today. The apparatus to do this is normal in Alzheimer's disease. In our society, we have to practice this, though. And so mindfulness meditation might be something we include in these programs for that reason. The creative impulse is generally spared as well, and visual arts-based therapy is often really helpful to people. The Fry Art Museum has a creative aging program that's centered on this that we've been very interested in partnering with, and we're about to do in a much more kind of thorough way in the near future. So some of the ideas I want you to take home: dementia is not the same as Alzheimer's disease. Dementia is the late stage of a much longer process, and the relationship of AD and dementia is modifiable by realistic lifestyle interventions. That message alone is often very hopeful to people, whether they're coming at it from the point of view of symptomatic or worried about maybe being symptomatic in the future. And neither Alzheimer's nor dementia is global, and there are retained strengths. And finally, you can lean into this disease and you can live well with memory loss. And that is the message we strive to get to with our patients. So we think the frame should be widened. There's room for other things. There's maneuvering room here. Mild cognitive impairment, subjective memory loss, or even normal cognition with Alzheimer's changes going on. This idea of cognitive reserve, the idea of engaging strengths, living well with memory loss, and even someday preventing dementia altogether. I'm going to take 1 minute to talk about our new project, the Hub for Dementia-Friendly Communities. This has been a dream of ours for a couple of years now. A physical space on First Hill here where we actually bring these principles into the public view and partner with other aligned organizations in Seattle, including the Dementia Action Collaborative, which is implementing the Washington State Plan to address Alzheimer's disease. We're in final stages of negotiating the existence of this, which would be just a couple blocks walk from where you are right now, in property that's owned by and adjacent to the Fry Art Museum. And can you imagine a less stigmatizing setting to take this on than a museum? Right? Off-campus location, inclusive, and aiming for a real region-wide impact. Okay, so thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be happy to